My name's Bill Walther, and this is Dave Sheridan, and we both worked on SP, and Dave worked on the UP until recently retired. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this interview was to get some primary material for future historians that they could use to understand what was going on here between the mid-60s and now. And we're going to kind of compare and contrast our experiences on UP and SP.
I think the most remarkable thing about our railroad career is when we started. I started in '69. Bill started in '66.
Yeah.
And there were full crews, so that meant at least 2 brakemen, a conductor, an engineer, maybe a fireman. And when you contrast that with today's train, there is 2 people up there, maybe just 1. So the force reduction is just astounding. I can't see how the railroads are not profitable now because their labor costs are nil compared to what they were 50 years ago. And there are no more clerks. The clerks used to take care of all of our paperwork, all of our train
Paychecks.
orders, everything.
Yeah.
All of that is now done by the conductor. The conductor is the clerk, plus he's the man on the ground, lining switches, coupling cars, and it's a very labor efficient operation now, and I can see why the railroads are considered good investments. Buffett bought the Burlington Northern outright. He owns it outright because it was such a good deal. And now, well, Amtrak between San Luis and LA and San Luis and San Jose only has 1 person up there. And I think that's probably the goal of the major railroads, freight railroads as well, when they get PTC, positive train control operating to the point where they can say, see, we don't need 2 people up there. The system is running the train, and the other person, the other operator, whatever you call them, conductor, engineer, he's just there in case something goes wrong with the PTC.
Yeah, I think something else that should be pointed out is that when in the mid-70s, SP was a major employer in San Luis County. There were probably close to 400 people working out of San Luis and drawing paychecks out of here and spending their money in San Luis. And now there's how many?
When I retired in 2020, I was the only engineer on the extra board. There was operating employees, maybe 5. But in other terminals where they run more trains, like Bakersfield, West Colton, they've got hundreds of people, but they run huge trains, huge amount of freight, but with very few people. It's really, really astounding how efficient the railroads have become, at least the freight railroads.
Yes, something else I'd like to point out is that the 2 of us are among probably the last dozen people in San Luis who have ever worked with train orders. And train orders were indistinguishable from what they were doing almost 100 years ago on SP, and that was brought to an end about the time I left the railroad. And a person in the 70s could have done railroading in the 1920s. There hadn't been that much difference. And after I left, all that was changed, and that was one of the reasons that they could operate with only 2 people, because you didn't need a caboose anymore. That was gone. 3 of the employees on every train was gone. And recently, the last steam engineer in San Luis died. And now there's very few of us left that ever worked with train orders. The only difference between train orders in the 1920s and train orders in the '70s was that they used telephones to transmit the messages. Train orders were transmitted from a dispatcher in a central location in LA, and they were transmitted to train order offices. There was one in Oxnard, there was one in Santa Barbara, there was one at Surf, there was one in Guadalupe. And in between those places, nobody knew where you were, especially between Surf and Santa Barbara. And it was pretty much guesswork of keeping trains from running into each other. And there were several different kinds of stop orders, and one of them was you had to wait at a certain siding until a certain time for another train to show up. And sometimes if they ran into trouble, you could be sitting there for 2 or 3 hours, which made things really inefficient because a lot of times our trains never made it from LA to San Luis Obispo in 12 hours. And one of our major jobs as extra board brakemen was that they'd call us out on what they called dog catching. You have to go out and rescue these crews that went dead on the law after 12 hours. And talk about inefficiency. They were paying 2 train crews to do the same job that 1 train crew should have been able to do. And I think their inefficiency was one of the reasons that Southern Pacific had to go out of business, and they couldn't afford to pay their bills anymore. What do you think, Dave?
Well, Southern Pacific, they had a lot of real estate, and I think their last days they were using their real estate to make the payroll. And then as the railroads consolidated, I think to just stay competitive with the BNSF, what used to be the Santa Fe and the Bernalillo Northern combined to make the BNSF. And that was a huge railroad and very difficult for just the Southern Pacific to compete against. So Southern Pacific and Union Pacific were natural merger candidates, and the Union Pacific had a lot of money, and they were, compared to the Southern Pacific, is very well run. They had, we noticed the difference in the equipment we had after the Union Pacific took over. We had new engines, maintained equipment. It was noticeably a more modern railroad when the Union Pacific took over. I think the Southern Pacific was suffering for years and years and years, and then when all the major railroads started making mergers, they had to merge with somebody to survive. And we were grateful they didn't shortline the Southern Pacific Railroad, break it up to little regional railroads and non-union, and that would have been bad for the employees. So we were happy that a major railroad bought us and had to honor the union contracts and our operating rules. All of that is fortunate for me and those of us who stuck with the railroad after the Union Pacific Southern Pacific merger. I shouldn't say call it a merger, as a takeover. The Union Pacific bought the Southern Pacific. I think, well, what do we got now in the United States? We got Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, and Bernalillo Northern, 4 railroads. I mean, when we started...
And there used to be 30 or 40.
Yeah, when we started in the 60s, there was dozens. And now they got they got the regional ones like Kansas City Southern, but all it does is go to Mexico and up to through the Midwest. Maybe there's probably some of those around. I can't think of any offhand, but the consolidation of the railroads was also a major change for us in our careers, along with the crew reduction. And then just in the last 10 years of my career, the telecommunication abilities of the railroad to run remote helpers. There goes a crew, because the engineer, the lead engineer, there's only one engineer. You could have 2 or 3 consists on the train, and it's all run by the lead locomotive. In the old days, there'd be a helper crew on every one of those consists. No more caboose, because they were able to communicate with the rear end, give you all the information you needed on the rear end with a telemetry device. Well, the EOT, end of train device, is basically a caboose in a little box about the size of a loaf of bread. It's the first ones were operated by a battery, and the newer models that were working, they had when I just retired, are air operated, so they don't need any. They don't go. The battery doesn't go bad, so you don't have failure on because low battery, and so the air supply runs a little generator in there, I guess, and keeps them current. But they give you all kinds of valuable information. First of all, if you got continuity, air continuity throughout the train, you got to know that you got your air pressure is on the rear is equal to your air pressure on the head end, so you know the train is intact. It'll tell you when you're stopped, of course. It'll tell you when you start moving. It will tell you when you. It's also got a very bright light, so somebody comes up behind the train, he can see the rear end. The EOT would, if you suddenly had a reduction in air, which maybe started a leak somewhere, the hose started failing, train line was failing, you could see your air pressure reducing on the rear of the train, and that meant you better stop and inspect this train to find out why the air is, you're losing your air. If you lose your air, you don't have any brakes, so that's a critical failure. So then the conductor would have to get out and inspect the train. It's 2 miles long, start walking, looking for some kind of air leak. Hopefully you could hear it. Sometimes you can't, and so there's a 2-man crew. That's where you'd like to have had a full crew, because if you could have somebody on the rear walking forward and somebody in the old days, the rear brakeman would walk to the head of the train and the rear one would walk to him, and then they'd cross over and inspect the train that way, get it done twice as fast. But I think the railroad just said that's the cost of doing business. So it's going to take longer with one person, but we only have to pay one person. And the one thing they drilled in our heads is there's no hurry. Do not rush, because they know that if you rush, you make mistakes. We first started seeing EOTs in the early 80s on the coast, San Luis Obispo, and they were probably introduced earlier on different parts of the system, but since we didn't see as much freight as other parts of the SP, we were probably the last where they introduced new technology. But the SP and all the other railroads, of course, they were so happy to get rid of the cabooses because, first of all, they're a source of injury. People got knocked around in those cabooses mercilessly. I mean, you got a mile-long train, there's a tremendous amount of slack. And if you're not ready for a run-in, you get thrown out of your seat, hit your head on the bulkhead. So they got a lot of injury claims the way those guys would get knocked around in those cabooses. And then they had to maintain them. They had to have a special track to put them on while they put the train together. And they were just something the railroad, as soon as technology provided all the information on an EOT, end of train device, that was available in the caboose, which you knew your air continuity. You had a light back there to warn a train following. It told you when you were moving. It said when you were stopped. They were a cheap caboose. And in the old days, when they first introduced them, I think an EOT cost, I don't know, $3,000. It's this little thing how could that cost as much as it does? But I think they even cost more than that now. They're tremendously expensive for such a little piece of equipment.
Right. Okay, I got to tell you that some engineers were better than others, and we had nicknames for at least one guy that I know of. We called him Bone Crusher because he operated the train so poorly that you were always being knocked around in the caboose. Yeah. And other engineers could pull the trains so smoothly that you thought you were on a passenger train.
Now I have to tell Bill that if you ran a train today like you did back then when there was a caboose, they would call you in and tell you it's time to go to the simulator for retraining, because the engineers who had a caboose, they would always have a little set in the train. The brakes were slightly applied, so when they went around a curve or were going start, they'd make a brake application, and then to avoid having a run in or the slack to run in, they would drag the train a little bit. And the railroad, if they see you today dragging your train, like running with an application, you're going to go to re-education school, because that's fuel. That's wasting fuel. They're all about fuel conservation. So I make trips between LA, San Luis and LA, and never use the air at all. Never. Don't even touch it. And they love it. They love me because I don't wear up the brake shoes. I don't pull the train when the brakes are set, so I save fuel. They're all about fuel saving. And so there's going to be run-ins, but there's nobody back there to get beat up. Maybe a couple loads of lumber will get shifted, but they can just restack it.
I got to tell you, though, the contrast between Southern Pacific and Union Pacific. And one of the reasons that they had cabooses was that they were so anti-technology that it was very late in the game where every caboose had a handset. So the reason that we had two people on the caboose and another brakeman on the head end was that if you broke the train in two, you could pass signals by hand and put the train back together again. And that happened fairly often,
Yeah,
but they were so set against any kind of technology that it was a long time before you had reliable radios on the caboose, much less on a handset that you could carry with you.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an example of how far behind Southern Pacific was technologically.
Yeah. They might have been so short in money they couldn't afford to buy the latest stuff, latest equipment, trying to squeak by.
And that was another reason why we went dead so often, was that sometimes the locomotives failed.
Sometimes.
And often.
Yeah.
And you start out from LA with maybe 4 or 5 locomotives on the head end, and when you got to San Luis, maybe 3 of them were running.
I can't tell you.
And so that slowed you down a lot going up and down hills and things.
Well, I can't tell you the times it's terrifying. You're coming down Cuesta Grade and you've got 3 or 4 engines and all the dynamic brakes on the engines fail. And that is really challenging. It's a frightening realization that you don't have dynamic brakes and you're taking this heavy train down the grade. You just have to be very, very careful, and if you use too much air in that situation, you have to stop, tie that train down on the grade and recharge. There goes a couple hours. But as I said earlier, when the Union Pacific took over, we didn't meet that situation as often, or very rarely after that, because they had such good, reliable power. Yeah, this thing about on the railroad, if something goes wrong, you're breaking two, or you can't communicate, or you have a bad meet, it just compounds. And the hours of service was the one federal law that they respected without a question. That means we can only work 12 hours. And they meant it. 12 hours, you better stop. They do not want you to turn a wheel after 12 hours.
Okay, another thing that I should mention, when I first started working in 1964, there was 16 hours that you could work.
That was horrible.
And there were many guys who, old guys like in their 60s, who would work 15 hours and 59 minutes so that they could go back to work in 8 hours.
Which was 6.5 hours, because you got a call. So you only had 6.5 hours. They call you with an 8-hour-and-a-half call. So you only got 6.5 hours off. That was brutal.
And I was 19 years old at the time, and I could barely keep up with these old guys. But they kept doing it, and I don't know how. But and then around 1970, they changed it from 16 hours to 14 hours. And then a couple of years later, they changed it to 12 hours. But many times you'd work from LA to Bakersfield and just barely make it into Bakersfield in 16 hours. And by that time you were starving because you'd only brought a lunch along, you know, to get you through. And some of these old guys, you know, had big old lunch pails, and but they didn't share with these young punks, I'll tell you.
Gosh, I forgot about the 16-hour law. That was horrible. That was.
You were here for that too, huh?
I spent 2 years, 16-hour law. Yeah, yeah. That seems medieval now. Oh, yeah, just terrible.
Well, they say that there were iron, lead, and wooden ships, and it was kind of like that on the railroad too.
The maintenance away, I don't think they have hours of service. See all the people out there on those high railers or the guys that are maintaining the signal system, they're considered non-operating, and they can work all night on an emergency, and then they have to go back on their regular shift a couple hours later. They can work 24 hours, which seems very dangerous. Just even driving home after that is dangerous.
Oh, speaking of danger, the scaredest I ever was one day we were going from LA to Indio, kind of going through the fog at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and I nodded off and sitting over in the brakeman seat, and I looked over and the engineer was sound asleep.
How many signals did we just get?
And that was, I woke him up, and we were just praying for a green signal the next one, because if it would have been red, we never would have stopped. And if there was something ahead of us, we would have been dead men.
Yeah, that's how it happens. That's how it happens.
But there was some safety in numbers in those days, because you had 5 people on a train. Usually not all 5 of them were asleep at the same time. Although that did happen at least once that I know of.
Yeah.
When a whole train went off the tracks in Bradley Curve, because every one of them was asleep. This happened like 3 o'clock in the morning, and the engine got around a 30-mile-an-hour curve. There was a straightaway that was good for 60 miles an hour, and then you had to slow down for the Bradley Curve for 30. This is right at the Salinas River, and the engine made it around the curve, but about 20 or 30 cars went into the river.
Did you hear the radio transmission between the brakeman walking the train after they go in emergency? They don't know they're derailed, so the brakeman starts walking back, and he sees a separation between this car, the head car that's still on the head portion of the train. Then he walks back and he finds the first car on the rail that's between the separation.
Yeah.
And he calls in the 2 car numbers. The dispatcher says, "We've come apart between this car and that car." And the dispatcher comes back about 5 minutes later. He says, "Okay, but what about the other 20 cars? Where are they?" Well, they were in the Salinas River. It was foggy and dark, and he had no idea that they'd gone in the break. They went around the 30-mile-an-hour curve at 60 miles an hour, which...
And as far as I know, nobody got fired over that. And part of the reason was that they were working us 12 hours on and 8 hours off and 12 hours, and everybody was complaining about it. And everybody knew that we were all overworked and under-rested. And as far as I know, nobody got fired over that.
No. Of course, those are pre-event recorder days. So you could say we had a UDE, undesired emergency, that could be caused by anything: a broken air hose, a failed coupler. But today, the event recorder is so precise. It knows if the brakes are applied by me. They know if the brakes are applied outside the engine or from the rear. They know everything. So there's no cover-up.
How about the surveillance on the engines?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Forward-facing cameras. Yeah, we have forward-facing cameras. Outward-facing cameras. We had those for 10 or 15 years, but just in the last 5 years, they introduced the forward-facing cameras. That was probably, every time there's a major railroad accident, where, like the one in Philadelphia in the last 5 years, where for some reason this engineer only, went around a curve that was supposed to be 30, went around it at 100, and he derailed, and there was several fatalities. And they want to know what's going on inside the cab. They know what's going on with the event recorder. It'll record what you're doing with the throttle and the air, but it doesn't know what you look like. So they wanted to have that inward-facing camera to see if somebody's texting or sleeping or watching a movie, for God forbid. All that is very visible, very visible.
Like Big Brother's watching over you at all times.
It's incredible what they can see on that. Yeah, they can see everything.
As opposed to when I was working, you could be sitting over there reading a book or listening to your Walkman, or
say we're a crew, and I have to go to the bathroom. And normally I would just tell Bill, watch it for me while I go down and use the bathroom in the nose. But that's not allowed. He's not supposed to be in my seat ever. So by the rule, you're supposed to stop the train and then go use the bathroom. And then, man, it's takes forever to slow the things down and then to start it back up. And all you gotta do is pee. So I'll be back in 2 minutes, watch it. But the event recorder, the camera is watching all that. And if they wanted to, they could say, what are you doing? What's the conductor doing sitting in that seat? But they know that they don't want to start something like that. They wouldn't pursue that, because it would just be, they'd ask me for tremendous delays.
As opposed to the time when I was working and would be going up the grade between Oxnard and Santa Susana at 4 o'clock in the morning, and the engineer wanted to get a few hours of shut-eye. So I'd sit over in the engineer's seat and blow the whistle, because it was in run 8, and all you could do,
go uphill for a whole hour.
If something happens, you wake the engineer up and you stop the train or whatever. But I didn't know anything about running a train, but it was good enough just sitting over there in the engineer's seat and blowing the whistle, making sure you don't hit any cars or anything.
That's right, the event recorders and the inward-facing cameras, yeah, they're, that's modern railroad. Jesus.
And something else I'd like to point out that the general public doesn't seem to get is that there are real people sitting on the engine and the caboose. And we experienced a lot of rock throwing incidents, when kids thought it was a lot of fun to throw rocks at the engine. And in fact, there was incidences of people sitting on the lips of the tunnels in Santa Susana, kids coming up from a park, and they'd be rolling big old boulders off the top of the tunnels, deliberately, trying to hit the engines, and sometimes people would get hurt. And another thing that I really objected to was suicides, that people stepped out in front of the train just to kill themselves dramatically and not thinking about the engineer up there who had to see these people being run over. And that happened, never to me, but it happened to a lot of other people that Dave could probably attest to.
You can't have worked on the railroad for any length of time without hitting somebody. Yeah, everybody's got several hits under his belt. Yeah, it's just the way it is. But actually, that's the good thing about those forward-facing cameras. When something like that happens, it's documented. You did everything you were supposed to be doing, and you were blowing the whistle. And some guy jumps out in front of you, or a car goes around a gate, and so that's evidence that you were not at fault for anything. Which that's the forward-facing camera was an ally in that respect, because after an accident, they're always going to go, well, you should have been doing this, or were you doing that? Blowing the whistle, ringing the bell, were you paying attention? And because they're going to look for any kind of any kind of negligence on the crew's part. And
Well, that probably saved them a bundle in lawsuits
oh
too.
yeah,
That,
yeah, yeah. When somebody says the gates weren't down when I was crossing, yes, they were down because look at the camera. They're down. You're going around them. That sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's very powerful. Yeah, that was a good thing about the forward-facing cameras. I don't know. They've been up there so much since you just forget about them. Actually,
Yeah, when I was working there, it was a lot like the Wild West, and we could do pretty much whatever we wanted, and nobody would know anything. We had one train master who was notoriously vigilant, or we thought he was, because he pulled a couple of things when he first came here, sneaking up in the middle of the night on a caboose out at Vandenberg, which nobody ever thought anybody would ever be checking up on, and caught a couple of guys asleep. And after that, everybody was a lot more alert.
I don't think you can get on Vandenberg now. They're so strict to get there now. With 9/11, you can't go on Vandenberg.
Well, it surprised me that nobody ever tried that, because it would be fairly easy for somebody to pull the air and jump out of an empty boxcar and do whatever kind of
Oh, you mean along the coast? Yeah.
any kind of terrorism they wanted to pull off, and who would know?
Yeah. Yeah, Bill, listen to you talk about the good old days. I think we skipped a century, because when you left, we were just coming out of the 19th century.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
when I retired, we're definitely in the 21st century. But the railroad hadn't changed since drastically until the late 80s. Then it started really changing fast, really fast.
Yeah, one of the biggest changes was probably taking the cabooses away
Yeah,
and reducing the crew size.
yeah,
And having the technology enough to trace where trains actually were.
yeah,
Because as far as anybody knew, between Surf and Santa Barbara, you could be anywhere,
yeah.
and nobody would know anything. And
Well,
now they have what?
Now they know exactly where you are.
Tracking devices.
Yeah, they know exactly where you are at all times.
And in fact, when I was working, we tried our best to keep the officials from knowing where we were. And we had little secret things that when you went by a scanner, you just push the button twice and it would go tick, tick. And instead of saying, clear the scanner, you'd be tipping yourself off of where you were.
Yeah, how fast you were going. Oh, were they announcing the speed when they went over the scanners in your day?
No.
They shout the speed out when you go over a scanner now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
back in the old days, in steam engine times, they didn't even have speedometers on the engine. So nobody knew exactly how fast you were going. Some of the better engineers would take out their stopwatches and click off telephone poles were spaced at a certain distance. If you went by 5 of them in 5 seconds, you'd know how fast you were going. But the guys on the caboose could do the same thing, but I rarely saw that happen. But I think radios were probably a major innovation, but that only happened after the war when those things started happening.
The railroads, not the handsets, but the radios
But the radios on the engines.
Yeah.
Before
remember all those stone phone booths they had all along the right-of-way where you'd get off and call up the dispatcher on the telephone?
Yeah, I did that a lot.
Those are, boy, you talk about telegraph.
When I was working between Indio and LA especially, there was a phone booth at each end of every siding. And so, you have to plead with the dispatcher to let you out of there, to get you home, or, whatever. Hey, man, we're starving out here. And he says, well, we got 3 more trains coming, and then we'll let you go. Anyway, those were the days.
Yeah.
In fact, there was one incident that I really remember. a helper engine got loose at Cabazon and rolled all the way down the hill before they knew who was on it. This was CTC, and the dispatcher could see on his board that there was something on the track going downhill, but they didn't know what it was or who was in it, and they had to derail it because there was another train coming up the hill, and they threw a switch down at the end of the hill, and these helper engines ended up out in the middle of the desert.
Were they unoccupied?
They were unoccupied. The helper engineers had gone to Beans over across the freeway, and when they got back, their train was gone.
Where's my engine?
And they had no way of telling anybody what had happened.
It takes nothing to move a car. You could the right spot, steel rail on a rail. You could push it. You can just push it.
Yeah.
It takes nothing. Yeah. So you got to tie everything down, chalk it, tie everything down, because it's going to roll.
That happened more than once.
Yeah. Yeah. There's some spots that are so, well, we can't leave anything on the grade. That's against the rules. They don't. It's just too dangerous.
Really?
Yeah. Even if you tie it down, somebody can go up there and release the brakes. It's going to take right off. What about the one at Margarita?
Vicky Shannon's and Bobby Nagel was on a train, and they were supposed to set out an engine at the west end of Margarita, and when they got back on the train, after setting out at least one unit, the engineer noticed that the signal ahead of them was red, and the only thing that could have caused that signal to go red was that an engine got loose, or the engine rolled out of the siding. So he signaled to the brakeman, and they cut the engine off and went chasing it down towards the Atascadero, and they finally caught up with it almost at Atascadero, and they were probably going 40 or 50 miles an hour. And the brakeman got on the last unit, and then he found out that the doors were locked. So he had to crawl all the way up over the top of the engine to get to the head end. And then when they finally caught up with the rolling engine, the knuckles were together.
Oh no!
And they couldn't catch it. So Nagel had to get out in the front and open up the knuckles. Jeez. And they finally caught it and drug it back to the train and set it out again. And all this was happening, and the conductor was smart enough not to be talking about. He didn't say anything. And
radio silence.
Radio silence. Run silent, run deep.
You know, the Anschutz would have filmed that and sold it to Hollywood.
Yeah, and so anyway, it was covered up for many years. Nobody ever heard about it. Nobody talked about it.
And it's past the statute of limitations. So
we can talk about it now, but in those days, everybody would have gotten fired, I think, if the truth would have come out.
Just lucky nothing was coming south.
Yeah, and yeah.
Or east.
But those sorts of things happened.
Yeah.
And nobody knew about it.
The other one got loose and rolled all the way to Welsona. Remember that one? That was Craig Sharp. He set it out up by the crossovers, and it had one of those dog leg brakes, not the wheel rake, but just ones like that. They're notoriously
staff
ineffective.
Brakes,
and they go onto Watsonville, and then after I don't know how many hours, the brake started leaking off, and these engine rolled right out of the side, and they figured it went through Paso Robles, I don't know, 50 miles an hour, no lights, nothing, just right through town. And it stopped at Welsona because there's Welsona, because there's a little bowl there. So they went back and forth, and finally settled down in the low spot. And then the southbound trains come in, and they keep getting red signals. And what's this about? There's nobody out here. Sure enough, there was an engine out in front of them.
It's called a mainline meet.
Yeah, those are not.
Those were not acceptable.
Those were not well regarded. No, sir. That was a bad one. Yeah. Yeah. But nobody got hurt. That's count your blessings in that one.
We got to talk a little bit about who got hired and fired back in those days, and Dave was one of the first hired off the street kind of guy.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
And
and I was really young too. That's another thing you won't see nowadays. I was 19 when I got hired. They don't hire anybody that young on the railroad. Most of the people that hired out last 10 or 20 years I worked, they're all old men in their 40s, 50s. I don't know what.
Yeah, I was 19 when I first got hired too.
I don't think the railroad does that anymore. They like, I think they like you to have done something else before you started on the railroad.
And also before Dave got hired, most of the people working there were sons of engineers, or my dad was a clerk in L.A. and he just said, "Hey, they're hiring brakemen in L.A. and it's a pretty good job for the summer." And so I
40
did
years
that.
later.
And I did that for a couple of summers when I was going to college, and but that's all that were working there was white guys whose parents or father was a rail. And when Dave got hired, did you read about it in the newspaper or something?
My father was a railroader too.
Oh, was he?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it skipped a generation. He worked on the railroad when he was young, but he wasn't working on the railroad when I started. And when you say those old guys, they were probably 60. I used to think they're ancient. They were only 60.
Yeah.
Here we are in our 70s. Now, that's old.
But one of the reasons I didn't get any more really good train stories out of those old guys was that there was a fair amount of generational antagonism, let's say that. They didn't think that we knew anything.
Which I didn't.
Which we didn't.
Yeah.
And not to mention I had long hair and a beard, and they thought we were all hippies and, couldn't possibly know anything or learn anything. And so they didn't talk to us. And they didn't even attempt to teach us anything. And it was mostly on-the-job training. And some of the nepotistic guys whose fathers were rails, they picked a lot of this stuff up that we didn't have a clue about. But I wish I would have talked to some of them. I'm sure they had some great stories to tell. And eventually they kind of accepted us and got a few stories, kind of off the cuff that these guys would say, "Oh yeah, there was a sighting here one time," and stuff like that.
Yeah. They had a lot of oral history if they're willing to divulge it. But I suppose after they didn't feel like they had to babysit you any longer, and you were earning your money, they were more accepting.
Well, that was another source of antagonism, was that 19-year-old kids were making the same amount of money as these 60-year-old guys who had a lot of experience and knew what they were doing, and they resented it. And I think it's different now.
Yeah, you don't hire out at the full wage. You have to. It takes at least 5 years to move up the pay scale to get. And all the contracts are different because they'll have a new contract and they won't include something that I enjoy for the next thing of engineers. So when I retired, Palmer and I got all kinds of little extra pays for things like you pick up an engine, you get an hour pay, or if you deadhead and if you deadhead to the terminal and you're layover for over 16 hours, you go on high-speed hat time, which means you get paid the rate of the van. That's a tremendous amount of money. They got rid of that, except they couldn't take it away from Palmer and me. So, well, now that we're gone, nobody has it, I suppose. All kinds of little.
When was the last time you made out a time slip with carbon paper?
20 years ago.
It's been that long.
Yeah, it's all digital. Yeah, all digital.
And you have to point out all your perks.
Well, they have it. They have a box that you can write a little paragraph of what you did, but they have so many categories. You just indicate this, 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 this. But they do have a comment section, but they've got it pretty, streamlined. That's another thing. When they're, not only do they want to eliminate crews, they want to eliminate timekeeping, somebody who has to, they just want it to be as seamless as possible. And that was sort of an argument for us going on salaries. It's just on a salary, so there's no timekeeping involved. You just go to work, you're going to get paid this much, and no arbitraries, nothing. Which towards the end of my career, because we were all on guarantees, which is basically a salary. As long as you didn't lay off, you didn't take any day off for personal business, you got paid, you could work every day and you'd make the same amount of money that if you didn't work every day.
Yeah, that's another thing I should probably point out is that when I first started working, everything was determined by miles. And it didn't matter if you went to work on a local, say, at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if you finished all your work, you could get out of there at noon, and they'd still pay you for an 8-hour day. And if you ever worked an 8-hour day, you were kind of considered to be a sucker for working a trainmaster's day. So everything, either you tried to get everything done in 4 hours, or you tried to get some overtime. So consequently, there were a lot of more accidents because you're trying to hurry and bend a few rules to get the job done as quickly as possible. And the same thing happened on the road. It was kind of a contest to see who could get over the road the fastest. Because if you made it from San Luis to Watsonville in 4 hours, you get paid the same as if you took 12 hours to get there. And so some of the engineers and the engineers were in charge. I mean, supposedly the conductors were in charge, but actually the engineers ran the train. And if they thought they could get to the next siding before the other trains showed up, they'd go for it because, they wanted to get back to the hotel and have a beer or whatever. And
get rested and
rested and go back again. And so sometimes I remember at least once going around curves at 60 miles an hour in a caboose, and you knew that at least 4 of the wheels were off the track. Because and then when you slowed down a little bit, clunk, it would fall back on the rail.
Yeah.
And that was a little scary.
Yeah.
And you didn't want to get on the radio and call the engineer and say, slow this sucker down, because, you didn't want to get them in trouble. But then again, it was a little hair-raising at times.
Yeah.
And I mentioned that to a trainmaster much later, and I asked him, was it ever talked about in the higher echelons of officialdom whether it would have been cheaper, rather than try and compete with trucks on a speed issue and try to compete with them on slow, solid, dependable transportation at a lower cost? And they said, oh no, we take great pride in getting our trains over the road. But it could have saved them a lot of money because speed lends itself to a lot more accidents. Did you ever think about that?
Oh yeah. Speed is the enemy on the railroad. You finally reach maturity when you understand there's no hurry and take your time. If all my biggest screw-ups I can attribute to getting in a hurry, cutting a corner. Yeah, speed is. I mean, even now in my car, I can't go over the speed limit. There's no way I'm going to go through a stop sign. I can't do it.
Yeah.
I stop. I'm conditioned. I can't speed and I can't run anything. It's just part of my nature now, because they're so emphatic about rule compliance. And now they have the hammer because they can see what you did do or what you didn't do. And so you just have to realize that everything you do is scrutinized in real time and definitely after the fact. If there's any kind of problem, they're going to go over that trip with a fine-tooth comb and point out all your errors.
But you'll have to admit it was a lot more fun back then.
Well,
That
yeah,
you could get on and off moving equipment, you could, you know, kick cars wherever you wanted to, and, you know, all that's
yeah.
history now.
It was more athletic. You could get on and off moving cars. You could. That was. It would drive you crazy now.
I'm sure it would.
So slow. You don't kick anything. You shove everything to a joint. You shove it in there, and before you cut away, you try the brakes down. Then you just sit there for 1 minute and wait to see if the brake holds the cars. You can't uncouple until you test the brake.
Yeah.
It's just.
I remember kicking cars in Lompoc, and one time I got on a moving car, and the brakes didn't work. And by the time they noticed that it was almost down the middle of Main Street,
Heading out of town.
Yeah. And you know, I was hanging on, and you're trying to slow traffic down because there was several streets that crossed there.
Crossing a lot of busy streets. Yeah.
So finally they figured, oh yeah, there goes Walther down.
Yeah. These two went up at White Hills.
Yeah, right. And halfway to Surf, but anyway.
I don't have the numbers, but I got to suspect they're moving tremendous amount of freight nowadays. Tremendous amounts compared to they were in the 80s. But where's all the yards that they used to switch these cars in? I don't see any yards. Bayshore Yard's gone. Oakland Yard is much reduced. San Jose Yard used to have.
Well, they don't deliver freight to little places anymore.
No.
I mean, San Luis Obispo used to have switchmen, and they would switch out cars for every place up and down the coast here in San Luis Obispo.
Yeah.
And you know, if you got a boxcar full of refrigerators delivered to the freight shed in San Luis, that boxcar may have been individually handled 10 times between the time it left the factory in Kenosha, Wisconsin or something, and by the time it got to San Luis, you know, maybe 10 different local switch engines had moved that car around. But
so what's the new now? Going to a warehouse in San Bernardino and putting on a truck and driving it up here? That's how they do it? Must?
Oh yeah, well, trucks have taken care of all that. I mean, when you think about a load of lumber that we would have set out in San Luis Obispo, for instance, the lumber yard would have had to send a truck up with a forklift and put it on their truck and brought it down to the lumber yard, whereas as opposed to, hey man, this is, you know, so it's a lumber yard in San Luis Obispo, and you're calling somebody in Eugene, Oregon, and they put it on a truck and it's delivered right to their lumber yard. Yeah. And that's part of the reason why SP went out of business, I think, was that there was so much of this local freight that cost them more to deliver it than they got in revenue. But that's all gone now, and nobody sets out an individual freight car to some little factory someplace.
No, I can't think of it. Nothing around here. Somebody gets something around here. They used to take Hayward lumber cars to the team track right there by the museum.
Yeah.
And they'd come in offloaded on one of their flatbeds. It took a lot of trips on that flatbed to move it to Hayward lumber, but. And
then again, they'd have to order a whole flat car full of wood, and you know, and then have to store it someplace.
Yeah.
And the same thing, you know, all those, and now they unload cargo in Long Beach and double stack it in containers, and they haul it all the way to God knows where, and they unload it with machinery and put it on flatbed trucks and take it directly to wherever they need it to go.
Yeah, well,
And, you know, the whole idea of railroading has changed tremendously between, well, the turn of the last century and, you know, in the 1950s. You know, they kept doing things the same way, but after containers and container ships and all that started happening, now they just put it all and deliver these wherever they want to, and there's very little local freight, right?
very little, yeah, just very little. Just big, around here was Phillips 66, John Mansville, which is Sea Light, and maybe a lumber car for Guadalupe. Santa Maria Railroad produces a lot of cars. I don't know what they do with all of them, but they get a lot of cars.
Yeah.
They must have some tractors. John Deere tractors comes in at Guadalupe, goes down to Santa Maria Railroad and take them to the John Deere store there. The oil train is gone. That was equivalent of let's see, 78 cars times it takes three trucks to haul one tanker, so that's 228 trucks to move all that
Well,
oil.
do you think that when they discontinued the sugar factory in Guadalupe, it pretty much was the end of the Coast Division? Think that had anything to do with it?
I don't know.
Because we brought hundreds of carloads of sugar beets
Yeah, that's true.
from both the Imperial Valley and from up and down the coast, and delivered it to the sugar mill in Guadalupe. And when that was over, that eliminated a lot of jobs for one thing, and a lot of revenue for SP.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened with there was an iron mine in between Indio and it's probably 60 miles out of Indio, and we had 100 carloads of iron ore that every day a whole 100 cars full of iron ore went to Kaiser Steel. And when they tore that out, that was a major loss in revenue for the railroad.
I don't imagine they make steel in California anymore.
I don't think, not from iron ore.
You know what was a big revenue for railroads just recently is they ran a sand train out of some place, you probably know, it's east of LA, it's up in the desert. They call it, oh man, it was a train of sand.
Yeah, well, sand is becoming a valuable commodity.
It was for fracking. They needed it to frack.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the big, really heavy trains, 12, 15,000 tons. Engines on both ends. Take the engine out of this desert place down towards Burbank, spot it. Somebody drove the engineer up to the other engines on the other end of the train. By the time he got everything set up, they'd emptied the train. That's how fast it took to empty that sand train. Yeah, the railroad's good for moving really heavy items, heavy gravel, rocks, oil, and if they don't need it right away either, and it can't perish, it can't be a perishable, that's not good, because so many perishable cars perish.
Yeah.
They don't make it before their due date.
Well, that was one of the first things to go in San Luis, was that there used to be a designated perishable train that left Guadalupe with 30 or 40 cars of perishable freight. and that eventually got sucked up by
Tall truck.
small trucks, and we called it the Smoky Valley. And if you caught that, usually left San Luis about 7 o'clock at night. You'd stop in. Sometimes you had to stop in Oceano to pick up a car, but most of the time, those cars were waiting for you in Guadalupe, and then you'd stop at Surf and pick up some more cars, and then in Oxnard there was probably 20 or 30 more, and by the time you got to LA, you'd have a 60-car train of all perishable freight, and they gave that the highball, and they stopped all the other traffic to get it to the East Coast before it all went bad. But that was one of the first things to go, I think. And there again, you had one guy in Guadalupe that his only job was to keep the refrigerator cars moving. Oh, and another thing, when I first started working, there was an ice shed in Guadalupe and in Oxnard, and they actually put chunks of ice in the bunkers on these old cars, and some of the farmers preferred having ice rather than mechanical refrigerators.
Yeah.
But I think that those were all gone in the mid 70s, at least.
The new perishable cars have GPS trackers on them, and they will tell the Omaha that the temperature on this car is rising, so it's probably the refrigeration is failing in there, and they will attend to it. Get somebody out there.
As opposed to, I was reading the East of Eden book recently, and one of the incidents in the book was that they had this big idea of sending lettuce to Chicago on a train around the turn of the century, or no, it must have been in the 20s, and they couldn't get it to Chicago before it all went bad.
Because the ice would melt?
Yeah,
they iced it. They put top icing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that because there's too much delay to the train, or just the train just
I
couldn't
think
make
it
the
was
schedule?
delay to the train.
I bet they made that trip, and if they could make that trip from Oakland to Chicago in 40 hours.
Yeah.
That's possible. They did that.
But that was a major innovation that kept people on the East Coast supplied with lettuce and fresh vegetables.
Yeah, we were the salad bowl.
And that was that was a big deal around in the 20s and 30s, that people on the East Coast could have fresh vegetables in the winter.
Yeah.